Welcome back to the class. We are in the last section of the essay written by Sundar Sarukkai. This is a response to Professor Guru's essay on egalitarianism in social sciences. He in the previous section, of the beginning, the first section of the essay, Sundar Sarukkai acknowledges that the concern raised by Guru is very prevalent in many other fields of modern social world, and it is very relevant. But he identifies that Guru's argument is more radical, because Guru is not concerned whether the other person is what a non-Dalit is saying, good or bad, but he says that the non-Dalit has no right to theorize about the Dalits, and that he problematizes by bringing in this whole idea of what it means to be a lived experience, because a lived experience is an experience where the subject has no control or freedom over the experience. Okay, it is not at your volition. The being is the most important. Okay, the being in a particular place is something important, and you don't have any control over that experience. That you experience that particular scenario by being a party into that. It is experience is not something connected with the material condition or the external world, but it is more to do with the experience of the person. The subjectivity is important, because a subject experiences no freedom to move out of that experience, or the subject has very less control over what that person experiences, regardless of that experience is something good or bad. And then he also talks about that the argument that if a subjective experience is supposed to be authentic, but then that argument goes against some of the principles of objectivity and scientific objectivity and scientific quality of the modernity, because modernity is always suspicious of this subjectivity, and modernity's claim of objectivity, modernity's depiction of objectivity or scientific rigor is mostly articulated in an objective manner without any so-called influence of subjectivity. Now, he is expanding that argument by talking about two terms, theory and experience, ownership or authorship. Again, very fascinating argument. One of the ways to distinguish the nature of experience and theoretical reflection about the experience is through the notion of authority. Is an individual an author of her experience? What is the nature of authorship between individual and the theory that she constructs? Okay. Who has the authorship over the experience? Authorship is an important criterion distinguishing experience and theory. A person who experiences is not an author of the experience like a person who theorizes about that experience. Okay? A person who experiences is not an author of that experience like a person who theorizes about that experience. We are not authors of our experience in the sense that we do not create that experience within us. Okay? We are not the one who authored it. Okay? You can, maybe the best example is to keep this idea of a Dalit life in mind. Okay, the Dalits, for Dalits, it is not out of their volition that they were born as Dalits. Okay. It is part of our nature to have such experiences, and there is no extra agency needed to initiate such a feeling from within us. The experience that we have can be broadly classified into two types. One arising from being the situations not of our making, and the other arising from situations we consciously put ourselves in. So, experience that, it's connected with the previous point. One is that the experience arising from being a situation of not our making. Your birth is not something that you can, decide, or a kind of a life that you have very less kind of control over it. It's again not within us, but it is imposed on you. You just have to experience it. Second kind of experience, he says, is something that you have the control over it. Situations we consciously put ourselves in. For example, the experience of being Dalit belongs to the former type, and experiencing the feeling of being drunk is often a consequence of a conscious act. Okay, so you drink alcohol and then you experience the effect of that alcohol. In the first case, we are definitely not the authors in any sense, the birth of a Dalit. we are neither authors of the events in which we find ourselves, nor the authors of the experience that is caused by such event. But it could be argued that we are authors of our experience in the second type, when you consume alcohol. We are not the authors of our experience. If we are not the authors of our experience, then how are we related to our experience? Okay, we are related to our experience as owners. A very, very interesting argument. We own our experience but do not author them. It is perhaps similar to the way we own books that we do not author. Ownership confers a set of rights over what we own, and authorship confers a different set of rights over what we author. In the historical trajectory of these ideas, we can see a sense of private and public playing out in these terms. Authors have copyrights and owners have certain other rights. For the purpose of discussion related to the rights of theorizing our experience, I suggest that it is a dichotomy of ownership and authorship that is most illuminating. Okay, so you do not own your experience because you are not the one who created it, but you own it because you experienced it. Once we make this move, Guru's claim to be rephrased in the following manner: an owner has a stake as an author. Okay, so according to Guru's perspective, an owner should make the claim of an author as well. Owner has a stake as an author. The extreme case of claiming that only those who experience can theorize implies that only an owner can be an author. Okay, is that a tenable position, is what Sundar Sarukkai is asking. Okay, I hope it is clear to you. It's not that complicated. It's very simple to understand. You do not own the experience that you are in. Okay, you are not authored it. You are not the one who created it. Okay, as in the case of a person who is born into a Dalit family, you had absolutely no say in your birth. Okay, but at the same time, since you are the one who own it, you are the owner. Okay, so what Guru says is that since you own it, you experience it, you have the authorship right over that as well, and nobody else should have. And is that tenable, is what Sundar Sarukkai is asking. To understand this, we need to look at the notions of the owner in great detail. What does an owner actually own? The owner of a book owns something that the book, in this case only the material constituting a particular book. The owner has no right over the book. She cannot print it and distribute it, for example. She cannot in principle change a few lines here and there and publish it as her own. Actually, there is very little an owner can do with the book other than buy it and perhaps read it. The owner owns that particular book, meaning thereby that there are specific acts that are allowed under that ownership. For example, getting rid of it if she does not like that book. Experience is like this. We own our experience, meaning thereby that there is only little we have control of it in that experience. Okay, there is very little that we have control over that particular experience. Most often we do not have control over what causes that experience. We do not have any say in how the experience should be. We have nothing at all to add consciously to that experience. That is, we can not either delete unpleasant elements or add pleasant elements to a given experience. Okay, so even though you really genuinely experience a particular situation, the amount of control that you have over that experience would be very, very limited, especially in lived experience, as in the Sundar Sarukkai's argument. Okay, now this is why experience enters into a problematic relationship with theory. Okay, because experience, first of all, the domain of experience that you experience, that you personally feel in a larger system is very limited. Secondly, you have no control over it in the larger experience, larger sphere. To theorize is to have a say, that is to be able to say. Okay, so any theory is a kind of a is a judgment about it, it's an explanation about it, it's an interpretation about it. To theorize about a particular experience is to have a say about the experience. Okay, to theorize about a particular experience is to have a say about it. You are able to comment upon an experience, and this commenting upon is what a theory is. Any theory building is an act of commenting upon, describing, and even passing judgments on that. And how can we really have a say having essay about an experience. Guru's position would mean that it is the owner who has the final say in saying anything about that experience, because Guru says that only a person who experiences has the right to theorize it. However, we can only partially accept this view because there are many elements of that experience that the owner is not really an owner of. We own our experience only in particular meaning of the term, and we may have control over only some elements of that experience. Even for example, say a question of Dalit atrocity. The person who experienced the atrocity, who is at the receiving end of that particular atrocity, how much ever atrocious that could be, is only part of the story. Okay, it's only part of the story. And any theorization of the atrocity of Dalit should also include the motivations, the ideas, and then the ideologies of the oppressive class, oppressive caste. Isn't it? Only then you will be able to theorize. Okay. If a caste insult is hurled on somebody, it could be quite painful a person to listen to that, and that experience could be quite traumatic. But in order to theorize that particular entire episode of a privileged caste position, upper caste position, using a particular term to insult a lower caste person, if it has to be theorized larger, then the theoretician must move beyond. Of course, he has to take into account the subjective feeling and experience of the person, but definitely they have to move beyond the particular field of experience and then look into the notions of privilege of the upper caste person, the kind of things that are available to him, the kind of languages and vocabularies and terms that are at his or her disposal, which they can throw at any time. So it requires a much larger frame. So we own our experience only in particular meaning of the term, and we may have control over only some elements of that experience. In principle, we can theorize about another person's experience because there is a space within that experience that is not related to the experiencer. For example, consider the element of oppression, which is a Dalit experience. Dalit who experience oppression legitimately own that experience of oppression. However, the experience of oppression also involved the oppressor, exactly the same point that we mentioned, either as an individual or as a system, and the Dalits have no control or ownership over the oppressor. So, how much of the experience of the oppression can be owned by a Dalit who experience oppression in a particular act? And this is also true in every case. This is also true in the case of women who are suffering in patriarchal system, poor people who are reeling under poverty, ethnic or religious minorities who are reeling under majoritarian politics. So all these scenarios are applicable to this particular case. Moreover, does a person who experiences oppression own the particular experience or larger categories that describe that experience? Is there a difference between a person who experiences oppression once as against somebody who experiences it repeatedly? Again, there are multiple internal divisions within that. For example, the Dalit experience could be distinctly different for men and women. So who exactly can, for example, according to Gopal Guru's argument, can a Dalit man write about Dalit women's issue? Okay, and again, as you know, Dalit is not a homogeneous category. There are multiple hierarchy within that. These questions are relevant because theory does this job of moving away from the particular. One's experience may not be enough to validate one's right to have a say about a conceptual world that describes that experience. On the other hand, not having any experience but theorizing about it also seems to be intrinsically problematic. That Gopal Guru is so critical about upper caste people descending on lower caste household or Dalit household and then making caricatures of them. This is the tension about theorizing that is manifested in two radically different approaches by two thinkers. At one end, we have Gopal Guru and his argument that only people who own an experience can theorize it. And on the other hand, we have Habermas, whose theoretical impulse, I would argue, arises in a response to an experience but does not expect the theorization to have anything to do with that experience. Interestingly, we can see a parallel in the different modes by which the Greek and the modern West and the Indians formulated logic. Logic is a fundamental to theory, but logic itself was described in different ways in these traditions. He says in Indian tradition, in Indian case, the logicians insisted that inference had to be grounded in an empirical, whereas the Greeks, particularly following Aristotle, formulated the logic logical in opposition to the empirical. So one can read this difference as an insistence that theory had to be grounded in experience, the Indian view, against the view that theory is in some way, some fundamental sense independent of the empirical. So he says that this division between empirical and non-empirical is something is much deeper, much deeply historical. There are different ways of understanding this opposition. One way is through a binary of emotion and reason. Experience is often placed under the idea of emotion and related terms, whereas theory is something that is presumably arisen under the action of reason. So that is what you can think about the previous examples where Dalit scholars are accused of only describing certain things very emotionally. The accusation, the suggestion is that why don't you move beyond these emotions and then theorize it. So theory is seen as non-emotional. Theory is seen as moving away above your individual experiences and then talk in more rational language. To hold Habermas's position is to give in to this absolute dichotomy between emotion and reason. There are many pioneers who pointers to why such a dichotomy seems to make apparent sense. Experience is first person, reason overcomes the individual capacity and also limitations. So any theorization you talk about, you talk in abstract sense, you talk about in universal terms, so it moves beyond the idiosyncrasies and the specificities of the individual experience. Experience is local and context specific. Reason attempts to establish the universal present in local specificity. So reason tries to establish the universal present in the local. Very, very interesting terms in the local specificity. So you theorize about violence and then try to see different forms of violence exist in caste context or racial context or in religious context. But these two terms also share similarities. Both of them seem to be outside willful and conscious behavior of individuals. We have experience just as we have reason. Yeah. Guru's position, in contrast to Habermas, is to erase this distinction and construct an essential relation between them. Asking for theory is to be essentially related to experience, is asking for reason to be essentially yoked into feeling, emotions and such terms. Very, very important argument. This yoking is not at the level of legitimacy, that is, Guru is not claiming that it is epistemologically legitimate or legitimate to not relate reason to emotion. He would like to claim that experience and reason are in some sense ontologically related. That is, they are related as facts of the matter. That is the reason why he finds an ethical component in this relation. It is ethically wrong to theorize about experience when one has not experienced the same to oneself. So Sundar says that the Guru's attempt in a philosophical reading is also to move beyond this binary between the reason and emotion, and to argue that this watertight compartment, this distinction must be broken. This distinction must be broken, and then theorizing also must be infused with emotions. So that is the argument that he puts forward. Now this is a this last section, theory as distribution of guilt, Habermas and the public sphere. This is a take, very interesting, again interesting take by Sundar Sarukkai, in which he problematizes or he analyzes Habermas, the very important German philosopher, who is known in academic circle, who is known throughout the world for his very fundamental and profound contribution to the idea of public sphere. So he looks at why that Habermas I'm not going into the details, but I'll just summarize the argument. Why that Habermas was talking about public sphere and then reason and a kind of a reasoned dialogue, a kind of an arguments and then kind of reasoned dialogue as the only way to modernity and to kind of a civilized world. So Sundar Sarukkai argues that Habermas was deeply motivated by the instances of Nazi Germany, the rise of fascism, and also the rise of neo-Nazis in the 80s and then 90s. So he basically, even though the issue of what happened in Germany was something very specific to Germany, he wants to theorize it further and then to take it beyond Germany, beyond the populace of Germany, beyond the borders of Germany, beyond that particular incident of Holocaust, beyond the specific groups of Nazis and then Jews and other people, and to make it as a broader one, make it as a global one, make it as a universal one. And that, he argues, is that kind of a theorization is nothing but the distribution of guilt. A very provocative argument, very fascinating argument. So Habermas always talks about in the language of universalism. Okay, he talks about the rise of public reason. He talks about the rise of public sphere. He talks about the need to have discussions and dialogue, and then he is a champion of modernity. Okay, Habermas is no doubt is a champion of modernity. So why that, or from where does this inspiration to theorize this universalism come from? That is what Sundar Sarukkai is asking, and his argument, his answer is that it is motivated by the specific examples of German people and the specific episode of Holocaust and the rise of neo-Nazism. So universalism for Habermas is a collective shared mentality, a sense of solidarity inhabiting public space that distinct from the political. Yeah. So this is exactly the same point. So I'm not getting into that too much, but we'll come back to. But this is the argument. Yeah. I suggest that what he is doing is using theory as an agent of distribute guilt. Theory does this very effectively in many ways, depersonalizing traumatic events, creating new categories to place these events in, create explanatory structures as part of the structures, abstracting concepts and ideas that then stimulate universality, and so on. So, a very bitter, a frightening experience of Holocaust can be theorized. Okay, it can be presented as a universal by taking it out of that particular context. Habermas could have responded to Nazi experience in many different ways, but as far as he used theory to respond to it, he is deploying theory for a particular purpose, that is of distribution of his guilt among others. His guilt is phrased in terms such as abhorrence of the Nazi experience, fear that neo-Nazism is rising, and so on. But in effect, theory, in the way he constructs this, functions as a distributor of guilt, just as much as Germany's now carry the world historical burden of the universal. It is a theory that carries the guilt of the inhuman acts of culture. When others participate in such a theory, they dilute individual sense of guilt for those who somehow associated with a guilt-induced action. Universalization is the ultimate dilution of guilt. Very fascinating argument. And now let's come back to Guru's position, how he compares it with. There is a precondition for theory to do this job, namely its capacity to establish a distance between itself and experience. So, Habermas' support to modernity and his thematization of the public sphere with its concomitant ideas of rational communicative praxis are not theoretical moves that arise from lived experience as formulated by Guru. Okay, so Habermas is able to abstract himself out of that local specific historical context, that incidents that happened at the time of Hitler and later. In fact, the crucial point here is that the experience cannot dictate authorship. Habermas's theory is for us, namely those who have not participated in that experience. So he's saying that such a theorization is, of course, it can be seen as distribution of guilt, but it is more powerful. Okay, it is more powerful. It is more effective. It is not restrictive in its ambition. It is not restrictive in its scope. Okay, it's much more broader. For Habermas, then, theory is legitimated by its distance from experience. If he accepts Guru's position, then he would have to say that only those who have suffered under the Nazi rule should theorize about it. So both Guru and Habermas stand on two opposite views in their approach to the relation between theory and experience. However, Habermas's approach can be usefully contrasted with the Levinasian attempt to theorize about Holocaust. Levinas's theory arises from lived experience, a lived experience of Nazism, and that he and his family had to endure. His construction of an ethical theory is directly mediated not just by an experience but by a lived experience in which the idea of necessity, as described earlier, is strongly encoded. Guru's approach to theorizing about Dalits is a Levinasian approach in contrast to Habermasian one. For both Levinas and Gopal Guru, guilt is not to be distributed and shared among non-experiencer through the guise of theory. Theory is to be felt, it is to embody suffering and pain, is to relate the epistemological with the emotional. That is to bring together reason and emotion. That is really the challenge that Guru faces on the practice of social science in India. Okay, so this is a very beautiful and fantastic intervention by Sundar Sarukkai, and you can see how he broadened, okay, how he really complicated some of the themes that Gopal Guru presented. When Gopal Guru presented, of course, he was so unhappy and unhappy with the existing social reality in India, namely the lack of theorization among the Dalits and the over enthusiasm of non-Dalits to theorize Dalit experience, and of course the kind of very extremely discriminatory and exclusionary practices that are happening in the academic sphere. But that concern by Guru has been made more deeper and then made more elaborated, and Sundar Sarukkai really expanded the horizon of that particular division. That is exactly what a philosopher does. In other words, what Sundar Sarukkai does is to distribute that kind or to universalize that particular kind of that particular kind of themes away from Guru, away from Dalit, into a much more larger question. So I'm sure that you would have really liked this particular argument, and that is why this book became extremely popular, extremely influential, and there are subsequent chapters which look at many of these themes very, very closely, but we don't have the time to go through that. But I would recommend that this is a must read, and you must have familiarity with this important book, because it's not only about social science, but it touches upon questions of ethicality, politics, Indian society, and a host of other things. So let us conclude this class as well as this week's discussion on this crack mirror, and we'll meet you for the final week in the coming class. Thank you.